Alright, before we get into this, let me just preface this before the angry comments start rolling in, saying things like, Terrifier's a masterpiece, or you just don't get it, because I do get it. I'm actually a huge fan of the Terrifier franchise, and I think Damien Leone is an absolute force to be reckoned with, and he knows exactly what he's doing, and honestly, that's more than I can say for a lot of big-name Hollywood directors. So trust me when I say, I respect the hell out of him and his insanely successful franchise. With that being said, it's hard to deny that Damien Leone's Terrifier franchise has taken the world by storm. With the release of Terrifier 3, the series has literally shattered box office records, becoming the most profitable independent film ever made. And I'm not exaggerating when I say ever made. With a budget of $2 million, Terrifier 3 pulled in nearly $90 million at the box office. That's almost 40 times its budget. And for those who don't know, a movie is generally considered profitable once it makes at least 2.5 times its budget. That kind of return is just absolutely insane to me. But as I was processing this, something else hit me. Something that made me start to worry about the future of slasher movies. I think we can all agree that the Terrifier movies became the phenomenon it is today because of its ability to push boundaries. The Terrifier franchise thrives on shocking audiences with extreme gore to the point of controversy. We all remember the headlines surrounding Terrifier 2 and 3 on their release dates. Reports of people passing out, vomiting, and walking out of screenings altogether because the violence was just that disturbing. Obviously, anyone with a brain could see that this is a clear marketing tactic designed to get people in movie theater seats. But the craziest thing about it all is that it actually worked. The hype was undeniable surrounding the movie, and honestly, the only time I remember ever hearing about hype around a movie like that was from the 1970s for the release of The Exorcist. In a genre currently oversaturated with sequels, requels, tired remakes, and A24-style art house horror movies, there is something weirdly refreshing about a small, independent slasher movie coming out of nowhere and shaking audiences that much. Hell, even I was curious to see what all the fuss was about. But I have to admit that despite horror being my all-time favorite genre, I've never been a huge fan of gore. All of that comes from my real-life experiences and actually seeing that kind of violence firsthand, so movies like Saw, the ones that push boundaries of brutality, never really appealed to me. And yet for some reason, when I saw Terrifier, it felt different. I saw Terrifier 3 on opening night in a sold-out theater, surrounded by friends who are probably some of the biggest fans of this franchise I've ever met. The energy in that theater was completely undeniable, and honestly, it was probably one of the best movie-going experiences I've had since Spider-Man No Way Home. But at the time I walked out of the theater, I had this nagging thought in the back of my head, worrying me that independent horror filmmaking was starting to hit a dead end. It made me start to wonder, are we reaching a point where indie horror's best shot at success is by turning the film itself into an event? Not through storytelling or innovation, but by manufacturing controversy and shock value? That thought really hit me when I was editing the director's cut of my first feature film, which just so happens to also be a slasher movie. This is around late 2024, like around the time Terrifier 3 hype was starting to finally die down, and if you've been following my channel for some time, you'll know that I recently put out a director's cut of that movie, one that leaned into the campy slasher tone the original cut was missing. Instead of trying so hard to be taken seriously, I wanted this new version to fully embrace the campiness and brutality that modern slasher fans love, maybe even expect at this point. I've talked about things before that I wish I'd done differently with the film, but my biggest regret was that I didn't make it gory or violent enough. And a lot of this has to do with the influence of the Terrifier movies. Instead, I stuck to the Scream-era slasher formula and prioritized the story and character over the actual thing that makes the movie a slasher movie. And while that approach might have worked in the 90s, I wasn't making a movie for 90s audiences. I was making a movie for today's horror fans, fans who watch Terrifier. And that made me stop to think, why would anyone want to watch a slasher movie without slashing? Because no one goes to a comedy expecting not to laugh. No one watches an action movie expecting a total lack of action, with The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1 being the rare exception, but I digress. But that's when it hit me. Indie horror isn't just evolving, it's being redefined. The expectations are shifting, and as a filmmaker, I felt that pressure firsthand. Slasher films were once a playground for creativity, but now they're measured by their ability to outdo the last in sheer brutality. And I have to wonder, where does that leave horror filmmakers who just want to do something different? Now, let me be clear, this isn't me sitting here whining, oh, my movie was just made for the wrong generation, or critics just don't get it, because at the end of the day, the bad reception to my first feature was because of its many flaws. But regardless, the point I'm trying to make is that movies like Terrifier don't just shape the future of indie horror films, making it so that that low-budget movies without extreme gore will struggle without Leone's money and brilliance, it's shifting Hollywood too. I mean, look at major slasher films coming out of Hollywood. As I mentioned earlier, it's mostly sequels, requels, or movies that take the Scream formula and mash it with something else. Like, for example, Happy Death Day is essentially Scream meets Groundhog Day. Freaky is Scream meets Freaky Friday. Totally Killer is Scream meets Back to the Future. You get what I'm trying to say here. Eventually, Hollywood is gonna run out of these ways to repackage that formula, and then what happens next? What's left? Well, the way I see it is the only way left to go is the Terrifier route. I predict that at some point within these next few years, studios will start to realize that the only way to get audiences excited about horror again is to create a spectacle around their films like Terrifier did. Nowadays, the best way to do that is to push boundaries. You push those boundaries just far enough to not be considered too controversial, just like Terrifier 2 and 3 did. And while that might sound exciting in theory, I can't help but wonder, is that really what's best for the genre? Now, to be fair, not every recent horror success has relied on extreme violence. Movies like Talk to Me and Barbarian prove that originality and psychological tension can still captivate audiences. Even Smile, despite its marketing spectacle, thrived on atmosphere more than it did gore. So maybe there's still hope for variety in the genre. But with movies like Terrifier setting new financial records, it's hard to ignore the growing appeal of films that aim to push boundaries above all else. I think it's safe to say that Terrifier isn't popular because of its story or its premise. And while Sienna Shaw has become one of my all-time favorite final girls, in my opinion, she's easily up there with characters like Sidney Prescott, but that's not what people remember these movies for. And as iconic and memorable as Art the Clown makes these movies, the character alone isn't usually what brings people back. With that being said, I have to give credit where credit is due. David Howard Thornton's portrayal of Art the Clown is literally genius, and Damien Leone is a master at shocking his audience, and with each Terrifier movie, he just manages to up the ante. The bigger the budget he gets, the more extreme the violence gets as well. And what's wild to me is that as each film goes further, the line between what looks like obvious special effects and what looks disturbingly real gets blurrier and blurrier with each film. Leone has proved that, when given the resources, he knows exactly how to craft some of the most visceral, stomach-churning horror out there. And while that's impressive in its own way, it also makes me a little bit nervous. Because if each Terrifier film is about pushing the limits further than the last, where does that leave Terrifier 4? What boundary is there left to break? Now, I will admit that despite how extreme these movies get, Leone has a way of making the violence feel tasteful in a weird way, if that makes sense. One thing he's been careful about is drawing a line between how violence is portrayed with the adult characters versus the children. And while Terrifier 3 does include several scenes of literal child gore, we never actually see the violence happening on them, only the aftermath of it. Like, for example, in the opening scene when the little boy is killed off screen while his younger sister listens, you can hear the violence that's happening in his bedroom, but you don't actually see it until the aftermath when his mom stumbles on her son's dismembered body parts. Or another example being the scene in the mall where the bomb explodes dozens of children. The violence is masked by the smoke and the special effects of the explosion, but the aftermath of that violence is shown, and we cut to their dismembered body parts. The film deliberately avoids showing how that violence was done to them, unlike all the adult characters who die in the film, who we get to watch be tortured and mutilated to death. But even with those levels of restraint, those moments still caused major controversy before Terrifier 3 was even released. The headlines practically wrote themselves. It was one of the movie's biggest selling points, pushing boundaries just far enough to cause outrage without actually crossing a line that would get it banned or boycotted. As I've stated several times before, that thought worries me, because if Terrifier 3 was able to stir up that level of shock without explicitly showing the child violence, how far will the next film go to keep audiences talking? And how will this affect horror cinema in the future? Let's say films being released 10 years from now. Ultimately, these kinds of headlines are a huge reason why Terrifier has been so successful. Because right now, horror isn't just about scaring people, it's about spectacle. And I know this because when you look at other original horror movies that have blown up in recent years, you see a similar pattern. Smile and Smile 2 are great examples of it because those movies weren't just popular, they became events. People talked about them as if they were the scariest film in years, or at least that's what the articles I read said, and whether or not that's actually true, it was enough to get people in theater seats, and those movies made a lot of money. And as we've seen time and time again, these tactics work, and as long as they keep working, horror cinema will keep evolving, whether that's for better or for worse. But who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll be so desensitized that what's shocking now won't even raise an eyebrow in the future. And I'll probably look back on this video and laugh at how concerned I was, but for now, all we can really do is watch and see where the genre goes next. My hope is that audiences will eventually crave something different, something that reminds them of why they fell in love with horror in the first place. Either way, horror is at a crossroads, and the next few years could determine whether the genre evolves or just escalates.